Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
They should be the most innocent members of society, but children can be capable of the most horrific, premeditated and violent murders.
I thought they are so sadistic what they've done to my son. Evil. Just pure evil.
What drives these children to kill strangers, their family, even their closest friends?
I have completely blocked him out of my life. I've pretended like he has died along with Ellie.
With access to police officers and their evidence.
Charging a 16-year-old with murder is heartbreaking because they are children, they are kids.
And the insight of a leading criminologist.
When you render your victim less human, it's much easier for you to be able to attack and kill them.
We ask if they're victims of their environment, or are they born evil?
What sort of person can do that?
We hear first-time testimony from the families of innocent victims.
They're scumbags, through and through, and I hope they have a terrible time in jail, which they should, being child killers.
As they reveal the devastating impact of losing a loved one.
20 minutes, that was all it took her to go home. And, yeah. And she died in my arms.
On the 13th of November 1999, in Litherland, north of Liverpool, at 3:31 a.m, Merseyside police received an emergency call from a young, male, anonymous source.
Emergency response to the call. Ambulance. There's a lad he's out in muffling car. How badly injured is he? Dunno. Think he's dead.
Police and paramedics raced to the scene, Moss Lane Park, and began to search. Nothing was found, but the call wasn't a hoax, because the next morning a man walking his dog through the park came across a body.
Right from the beginning, it was clear how horrendous it was straight away. The injuries that Michael had sustained were appalling.
The body was that of 15-year-old Michael Moss. His mother has never spoken of her ordeal before.
I still can't believe it. When this first happened, what did I want to do? I wanted to kill them. I wanted to kill them.
This brutal and violent killing would come to be known as the Reservoir Dogs Murder.
They took penalties with his head. They lined him up. They pretended they were playing football and they were taking penalties. They jumped off climbing frames, 2-footed onto his head. They cut his body beyond recognition in certain parts. They played games with his body.
It had a massive effect on the community. There was just massive shock and grief.
Shockingly, the killers were just 15 years old.
I don't think you can rehabilitate evil. I'm sorry. Those 3 boys are evil. You cannot rehabilitate evil.
Michael Moss was born just before Christmas in 1983.
He was a good child, lovely little baby. I had to go back to work. We just moved in this house. So I had Michael on the 22nd of December and I was back on work on the 31st of December. So because we just got this house and we had 3 children and, you know, my husband worked, he was an electrician, and having 3 children, you know, I needed to go back out to work because we needed more furniture for the house, really.
Michael was just a typical child from Liverpool.
He loved football. He played football for the school team. And my family are Evertonians, but Michael had to be different. He was a Liverpudlian.
And as he got older, he grew fond of anything mechanical.
Michael wasn't very academic. He could take anything apart. He could take a bike apart, he'd put it back together. He loved motorbikes. He liked car racing. He liked motorbike racing. And he loved football. And he loved going out with his friends.
But above all, Michael loved his dad.
Michael was very, very close to his dad because of a night time I had to go out to work. So my husband Brian would come in from work and he'd take over the children while I went to work.
But when Michael was just 11, he and his close family would have to deal with a terrible tragedy.
Everything changed. My husband went to work one day and he didn't come home. And we were all devastated by that. My husband had gone to work and he had a brain hemorrhage.
It was only during visiting times that Michael realised the father he doted on had been replaced by an angry and unpredictable man.
My husband's brain injury was where he would swear. My husband never swore. He was a good husband. He never swore. He had anger issues as well. He just wasn't nice to us. He used to spit at us, but that wasn't my husband. That was the brain injury. And Michael, he couldn't quite grasp. He couldn't, he was upset that wasn't his dad anymore.
Michael's dad never came home from hospital and passed away that year. The effect on Michael's mental health was devastating.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the key event in Michael's brief life was the death of his father when he was 11 years old, and he was particularly close to his father. Now, young people experience bereavement in much the same way that an adult would experience bereavement. The range of emotions would be anger, regret, surprise, depression, anxiety. If you're only 11 years old, you're suddenly faced with a series of emotions that you've never previously experienced and don't, at that stage in your life, have the psychological infrastructure to be able to cope with those emotions. And therefore, unsurprisingly, in Michael's case, it means that he no longer wants to engage with school.
Michael became so disruptive in class, it was decided he should be excluded.
Michael got excluded from school. And he ended up going to a pupil referral unit. He had educational needs. And he was quite happy going to the pupil referral unit. And he went every day, and then the next thing he starts going missing. I didn't know where he was. It was just getting all too much for me. He was under an educational psychologist, and he had a social worker. And to give me a break, they said they'd take him into a unit to give me a break because I just didn't know where he was all the time. He was running away.
Michael moved into a children's home near Moss Lane Park, but it wasn't a care home. Michael could come and go from here whenever he wanted, including going home to Mum.
It was for children who had educational needs. Like, Michael could not cope with a lot of people, in crowds. I don't know what the other children, some of them had attention deficit disorder. That's what Michael was diagnosed with as well.
But it started to work. He knuckled down and got on with his studies at the pupil referral unit. He made friends easily and was receiving counselling for his grief. But at the start of the new school year in September 1999, when Michael was 15, 2 new boys joined the pupil referral unit. Alan Bentley and Mark McKeefrey were among the most feared boys in their old school, Litherland High.
So Bentley and McKeefrey were friends, and the 2 of them had been expelled from a mainstream school because they had beaten up another boy. That matter was never reported to the police, but because of that expulsion, they then would have been sent to this school in Formby, Poundfields, for children who've got difficulties, shall we say.
We're dealing with 2 young men who were excluded from their mainstream school because they were the school bullies. So they're excluded because of their willingness to use violence or the threats of violence on their peer group.
They were close friends. They had a relationship, and they knocked around together. They did a lot of things together, None of these boys involved had high levels of criminal records that people might think would be there immediately. They must be bad through and through. That wasn't there. It was a very bland picture of what these boys were before this event. It was a really strange inquiry from that point of view, because we all stereotype, we try not to, but we all generally do it in our day-to-day life, and probably the anticipation of a long list of offences on the police computer and this, it just wasn't there.
The arrival of Bentley and McKeefrey would have deadly consequences for Michael.
They were 16 years of age. I went out to work at 15. They knew exactly what they were doing at 16 years of age. They weren't children. Well, they're adults. Do you know? They knew what they were doing.
In September 1999, 15-year-old Michael Moss was attending a pupil referral unit called Pinefields, north of Liverpool. His mother couldn't have known that sending her son to this special school would lead him into the hands of a gang of sadistic, bloodthirsty bullies.
I've never read a post-mortem record with so many significant injuries, all with the contributing factor that they led or were part of how Michael actually died in that field.
I couldn't believe they were only 15 years of age. So I was just distraught over it, why would they do that to my son?
15-year-olds Alan Bentley and Mark McKeefrey were also sent to the pupil referral unit that term.
At a common sense level, a pupil referral unit shouldn't really work, because that unit is going to house every disruptive child in the surrounding area. It's a recipe for disaster. However, that fails to acknowledge that pupil referral units are often incredibly successful. The staff-student ratio in a pupil referral unit would be much lower than the staff-student ratio in a mainstream school. So pupil referral units have got staff who are also trained in particular ways to deal with young people who are causing problems.
Bentley and McKeefrey were sent to the unit because they were uncontrollable bullies.
Bullies are people who like to inflict the maximum amount of psychological or physical damage on their peer group for a range of reasons. The range of reasons might be about gaining an income. They can threaten young people to give them money. It might be about establishing their identity, their place within the pecking order. It might be a way of performing masculinity. It might be a way of establishing themselves in a culture in which they don't feel particularly secure.
The boys were sent to the referral unit to receive a more targeted education, but it didn't seem to be working.
McKeefrey and Bentley didn't seem able to adjust their behaviour once they had been in the pupil referral unit. And that, for me, is the key issue. The fact that there were bullies in mainstream education, they remained bullies in the pupil referral unit.
15-year-old Michael Moss was at the same unit for his own special educational needs. He knew who the bullies were and kept his distance. but he'd started seeing Bentley's ex-girlfriend. And when Bentley discovered that she and Michael were dating, he was furious.
That had incensed Bentley, and he was intent upon revenge. He passed a message once saying words to the effect, "Tell Mossy I'm going to kill him. I'm going to boot his head in."
As a school bully, suddenly your childhood sweetheart leaving you to go to somebody else is a way of denigrating, of losing your self-esteem. He would have interpreted what happened very poorly. He would have seen this as an assault on his sense of self, as an assault on his identity.
Though incensed, Bentley didn't act immediately. He bided his time.
He waited for 4 weeks before Michael was eventually killed. And in between time, we've got this added dimension of a third young man entering into the pupil referral unit.
That young man was another 15-year-old boy called Graham Neary, who'd been expelled for stealing.
Neary had his own difficulties. He was also expelled from a school that was for a matter of dishonesty. The three of them seemed to become friends, and Michael didn't become friends as such, more knew of them. McKeithry and Bentley were known for violence, and so he was keen not to associate with them.
Now Bentley had a new friend to impress with his masculinity.
I think Bentley needed to show Neary he had to put up or shut up. He had to be seen to be acting on the sense of he's the gang leader, he's the number one, he's in charge. And it's Neary coming into the group that seems to me to be the incident that forces Bentley's hand.
Bentley wanted to show Neary that he was the top dog, and on the 12th of November, he found his opportunity. It was his birthday, and he threw a party for his friends at his home, where the highlight of the evening was a screening of Quentin Tarantino's new film, Reservoir Dogs.
So it gave rise to, I suppose, political debates about whether, teenagers should have access, underage children should have access to these kind of films, and the differing views on whether that should be the case.
While they watched, the boys binged on vodka. Neary was so drunk he passed out. Bentley then hatched his plan. He got McKeithry to call Michael at his care home and use Michael's love of motorbikes as a lure.
He gets a phone call around about 1 a.m, and the way they've lured him out is this bogus story that they've got a motorbike and they want to show him this motorbike, and him being young at the time, 15, and obviously 15-year-old boys are excited by the thought of motorbikes. It was too much of a temptation to come and have a look at this supposed motorbike.
Michael took the bait. He didn't need permission to leave the home, but he did have to tell someone he was going out.
So the staff there knew that Michael had left the centre after a phone call into the centre from Bentley and McKeithry. And they knew that he was going out, and they believed that he was going to be meeting with them.
The staff at the children's home were aware that he was going out, and they pleaded with him not to go out. But it's not a prison where he was staying. It was a children's home, and they were free to come and go. So effectively, they could advise him, "We don't think this is a good idea," but and he went, and the rest is history, really.
Michael met up with McKeithry and they walked into Moss Lane Park, but there was no motorbike to greet them, only Alan Bentley. Bentley's attack began with a headbutt, but soon escalated. After an initial beating, Michael was stripped naked.
Stripping Michael is a way of demeaning him. It also has sexual undertones as well, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that the supposed cause of the attack on him was the fact that he had started to date Bentley's childhood sweetheart. So stripping Michael is a way of demeaning him within the group.
Most of the kicks were aimed at Michael's head, but many targeted his groin.
This seems to me to underscore the fact that there were sexual undertones at work here, that attacking the groin was to render Michael less sexual, less potent, given the fact that he was now dating Bentley's childhood sweetheart. This is a way of demasculating, emasculating Michael. And so we should underscore and not ignore the fact that there are pseudo-sexual elements to what we see happening whilst Michael is still alive.
The beating stopped, and Bentley and McKeefery went back to the party to boast to their new friend.
They go back to where they've been with Neri, wake him up, he's asleep, they wake him up, they tell him to come, they want to show him something.
What followed is how this horrific attack became known as the Reservoir Dogs Murder. Bentley and McKeefery took Neri back to the park to show him their handiwork, and then the violence continued.
They'd gone away and then they'd come back and they carried on with the assault. They took penalties with his head. They lined him up, they pretended they were playing football and they were taking penalties. They jumped off climbing frames, 2-footed onto his head. They cut his body beyond recognition in certain parts. They played games with his body.
Bentley smashed his bottle of vodka and began stabbing Michael.
They'd chosen to scratch onto the back of Michael's body. They played a game of noughts and crosses, which none of it makes sense. I can't, in my 27 years of being a cop, understand why anybody would jump 2-footed onto someone's head from a 6-foot playground, let alone scratch a game of noughts and crosses.
Michael died in the park from a broken neck. But it didn't stop them. Incredibly, the torture continued as Bentley played out an act he'd seen earlier that night in Reservoir Dogs.
The case is fairly notoriously known as the Reservoir Dogs Murder because of the awful details in which one of the killers uses the jagged edges of a broken bottle and effectively tries to slice his whole ear off.
Post-mortem behaviours are often very helpful for a criminologist or a forensic psychologist in thinking about what might have motivated the attack in the first place. And in relation to the post-mortem behaviours after Michael has died, we have this extraordinary incident whereby his ear is going to be cut off. Again, that's about denigration. Again, that's about making Michael, even in death, less human than the perpetrators. He is less sentient, he is less visibly obvious as being human like you and me. When you render your victim less human, it's much easier for you to be able to attack and kill them.
At 3:31 a.m, a 999 call was made. An ambulance rushed to the park, but nothing was found, and it left empty.
We were aware that there had been a call because ultimately the ambulance came out in the early hours of the morning, but due to the dip where Michael lay, he went unsighted at that very first call. I don't believe it made any difference. The injuries that Michael had, to me, Michael will have been dead, or he'd been very, very close to death.
It's believed that the 999 call was made by McKeefery, but he's never explained why.
Whether it was a trigger of guilt, whether it was a feeling that this has gone too far, whether it was a cry for help, I don't know. I couldn't tell you what that was.
So this phoning of the ambulance seems to me to be simply a very weak attempt to establish some kind of alibi for the three perpetrators at a later date. In other words, they could say, oh, we called an ambulance and he was alive, he must have died later. It's not our responsibility. I simply see this as a deflection, a childish, amateur deflection, but a deflection nonetheless.
15-year-old Michael Moss died that night, a victim of a brutal and unprecedented attack. The murder horrified the community, but it would lead to a first for the criminal justice system, when Liz would come face to face with her son's killers.
Yeah, I was angry. I was angry, and you're not allowed to say nothing to them. And I couldn't help myself. And I just said, you can't look at me now. I said, you still can't look at me, can you?
15-year-old school bully Alan Bentley had been dumped by his childhood sweetheart for another boy, Michael Moss. The feelings of rejection made him incandescent with rage.
The motive certainly seems to be in the jealousy and the revenge wanted for the kind of being spurned by his girlfriend.
Bentley and two of his friends, Mark McKeefrey and Graham Neary, lured Michael to a park in the middle of the night and brutally beat him, tortured him, and played with his body. Detectives had never seen anything like it before.
The injuries that Michael had, over 100 injuries, the majority above the shoulders. Not pleasant for seasoned police officers.
At 7:30 a.m. on the 13th of November 1999, a dog walker came across a body in Moss Lane Park, Litherland, near Liverpool. Detectives were on the scene quickly, as Copy Lane Police Station was less than a mile away.
It was taped off, if you could picture the scene, and walked up through the tape up to the senior investigating officer and the forensic investigators were already there. It was clear as soon as I arrived that it was a child, a young boy. Made all the matter worse that he was lying naked.
Uniformed officers had already begun house-to-house inquiries of the area, and that included knocking on the door of Michael's care home, not far from the park.
So it initially come up that there was a young boy fitting a similar sort of age was missing from that centre. And the staff were clearly upset, clearly highly traumatised, but at that stage they were in the same position as us. They didn't know that this was definitely Michael that was lying in the field less than half a mile away. I was handed a photograph of who we believed it could be. So I had that, and it was a full facial photograph, clear as day, a young boy called Michael Moss. I took that photograph back to the senior investigating officer. We held it directly adjacent to Michael's body, not for a second believing it was Michael because of the picture that we had and the state of the body. And I can vividly remember holding that picture right next to the face, and there was no way from that picture you could identify that as Michael.
One of the staff was persuaded to identify the body and confirmed it to be 15-year-old Michael Moss. The police now needed to inform his mother.
I was listening to the radio, and he said, I heard it on the radio that they found a man's body on Moss Lane playing fields.
You know what you've got to do, and you know it's not going to be good. I can remember walking up the path, knocking on the door. You could see someone behind the glass in the door as soon as we got there, as if they knew we were coming.
And I looked. I said, it's him, isn't it? So they said, can you just go in? I said, it's him, isn't it? So I just went berserk.
And she reacted in a way that you'd probably expect, just complete and utter anger, disbelief, didn't want to hear it. Did everything she could not to hear it from us, to the point where, she'll probably smile about it now. I can probably smile a little bit, but throwing skirting boards out the front door, not letting us in that hallway. She did not want us to walk in that house to tell her that Michael was dead. I think anyone could close their eyes and imagine what that scene was like, imagine what it would be like if it was yourself and any member of your own family. It was complete and utter devastation.
At the care home, staff told police about the threats Bentley had made towards Michael.
We had names, so we now needed to identify where they lived, what the relationship was with Michael, why they would be in a position to lure Michael out to the assessment centre in the middle of the night. Very clear, it had come out already that there'd been Bentley was in an argument with Michael over a girlfriend. Michael had met a girl who Bentley had used to go out with, so all the elements were starting to piece together quite quickly.
But before police could begin to try and hunt them down, they got a huge breakthrough.
And then at that time, totally out of the blue, there's a message from the front desk at Copy Lane, and Neary's mum had brought him in, and they wanted to speak to the police about the murder of Michael Moss.
Neary, racked with guilt over the killing of Michael, had caved in and told his mum. He named Bentley and McKeefrey, and they were soon rounded up.
So they were all in separate police stations. And the process of the interviews and the building of the evidence case started there.
While in custody, the boys' homes were searched. In Bentley's house, one chilling piece of evidence was discovered.
Next to his bed in his bedroom, there was a comic strip that he'd drawn himself, and it depicted the process of the murder of Michael Moss.
Bentley has never revealed whether he drew the pictures before or after he killed Michael.
Did he draw it before? Did he reenact what he had already drawn and how he depicted he wanted to do with Michael? Did he draw it after as a reflection on what he'd done?
If he had drawn those things prior to the murder taking place, that would imply something about his feeling of lack of agency, his need to be seen as being powerful and in control and in charge. I've worked with many violent young men who felt no self-esteem, but one of the ways that they could imagine themselves being more powerful was in their fantasy life. And in their fantasy life, they were killing people or stabbing people or being super gangsters. If these drawings came after the murder, then that's about a way of trying to process what it is that he's done, either because he's ashamed of what he's done or because he's trying to reveal that it was him that engaged in that behavior. I often say that guilty secrets find a way of making themselves public. And it's speculation, but if this drawing came after the murder, this is about Bentley trying to make public his guilty secret.
Despite the discovery, only Neary was willing to admit the awful crime. Bentley and McKeithry denied everything. It meant forensics teams had to provide some proof.
We seized washing machines from the parents' houses, because even if something is washed, there's still an element that there may be a trace within that machine. So I can remember that. I remember washing machines getting trailered into the exhibits room. I recall, I seem to remember that there were fingerprints on some broken vodka bottles. They'd chosen to scratch onto the back of Michael's body. What we were unable to do by some unbelievable work by the seizure of some of the exhibits, I remember there being a jumper, so it's soaking wet, it's sodden, it's been in the November morning for hours on end, and it's recovered. But that was subsequently treated and exhibited correctly, that it showed footprints.
The footprints would be shown to come from Bentley and McKeithry's trainers. While at Neary's house, police found a heavily blood-stained top and trainers that matched an imprint on Michael's groin.
The forensic evidence as it carried on going just became extraordinary. It was clear what they had done. And then by not giving any sort of account, we just painted that picture and kept going and going and going until we had a clear account of exactly what happened on that night.
Detectives had enough to charge the three boys with murder and broke the news to Michael's mum.
So, I just couldn't get my head around that boys that were friends with Michael could do that to one person at that age of 15. I couldn't believe they were only 15 years of age. So I was just distraught over it, you know. Why would they do that to my son?
But that wasn't the end of Liz's ordeal.
My son had 5 post-mortems. And that was devastating to us. All I wanted to do was lay my son to rest. And I couldn't. For 6 weeks. Because my son didn't belong to me. He belonged to the coroner.
So you've got to manage expectations, you know, and it is a real fine balance, because to get people convicted, to deal with it properly, you've still got to treat Michael as an exhibit, but also Michael is a person, he's a son, he's a brother, you know, and Liz and her daughter's expectations are they want to comfort the son, but Michael's still an exhibit, but they're human beings, they want to do those natural things, and it's very, very difficult to find that balance.
The trauma of losing her son had a devastating effect on Liz.
and the emotions. I never went out for 3 months. I couldn't go out because I was too scared, because people were looking at me. I was just too scared. I ended up under a psychiatrist. I've ended up being under a psychiatrist, suffering from post-traumatic stress, depression. Put on pills, put on tablets, just to get you by each day. It was a terrible, terrible time. Terrible time for all of us.
And only as the weeks passed did Liz find out the truth about the horrific torture that Michael endured.
I thought they are so sadistic, what they'd done to my son. Evil. Just pure evil.
Michael Moss's lifeless body was discovered at 7:30 a.m. on the 13th of November, 1999.
You can't imagine, and I wouldn't expect anybody to imagine, but you can't underestimate the detail and the effect that it would have on somebody. The injuries that Michael had, over 100 injuries, the majority above the shoulders.
One of the killers, Graham Neary, couldn't deal with what he'd done, and racked with guilt, remorse and shame, he went home to his mother and confessed.
So Neary started talking straight away. He wanted to tell us what had happened and who the main offenders were.
The trial at Liverpool Crown Court began on the 9th of July 2000. Bentley and McKeithry both had the same defence ready.
At the trial, the killers tried to ludicrously claim that the attack came about because Michael had suggested that they attack him and that he would get some kind of compensation for his injuries, and then they would then share that amongst themselves.
The story was dismissed by the jury, who were told the real motive for the murder.
It was referred to by the judge in the case that it was a premeditated attack fueled by revenge.
And there was much discussion on the effect of violent films on young teenage minds and whether it might have played a part in the murder.
There is no criminological evidence to demonstrate a causal link between viewing violent movies and engaging in violent behaviours. However, at a common sense level, quite clearly some people can be influenced to behave in particular ways as a consequence of what it is that they've seen, either at the cinema or at home on television.
On the 26th of July, the jury found Bentley and McKeithry unanimously guilty. Neary was found guilty by a 10-2 majority.
There was quite a number of female members on the jury, maybe 5, and I think they were all in tears. McKeithry and Bentley showed no emotion, which probably fits into what we've heard about their kind of mindset and how they were. Neary was visibly very upset, and he hugged his mum.
Bentley and McKeithry were detained for a minimum of 10 years, Neary for 9 years.
And I thought that was too lenient for what they'd done to my son. But it was the courts of human rights. That's all they could give them, was a 10-year tariff because of their age.
Despite her anger, Liz was now asked to play a role in the killer's rehabilitation.
The government decided they want to give the victims more of a say in what was happening in the criminal justice system. So they requested that the probation service provide a service to victims of serious crime. They called them victim liaison officers.
After serving 2 years, Graham Neary appealed his sentence. Liz was asked to provide a victim impact statement, the first time this had ever happened.
I was trying to keep them inside, so I was the first in the country to go before the parole board. And it's where I could go and give my view on them.
I had a lot of respect for her. She had a lot of anger, a lot of sadness. Anger towards the people who'd obviously murdered their son.
Neary failed in his appeal, but 6 years later he came up for parole. Liz was asked to meet Neary and read another victim impact statement to him. He was 25 years old.
So that was the first time that we'd gone into that sort of arena, and that was quite scary for her, as you can understand. I was anxious, but I'm used to going to prisons, so it wasn't too bad for me, but I wasn't used to going into a parole hearing as a victim liaison officer.
No one knew what they were doing because it was the first one in the country. It was just daunting, really, because it was a big room and there was all people in there. And I didn't know who these people were.
She took a picture of Michael, a framed photograph of Michael, and put it on the desk in front of her, so the panel could see him as she spoke about him and what had happened to him and how the family felt. And part of me thought, oh, is that the right thing to do? But it had an impact, I think. And she felt as if she wanted to bring Michael alive for that, for the parole board, to see him that he was a human being, he was a person. It wasn't just someone we're mentioning here. And I think that helped her.
Liz was not allowed to speak to Neary. She was only supposed to read her statement to him.
I was angry. I was angry, and you're not allowed to say nothing to them. And I couldn't help myself. And I just said, you can't look at me now. I said, you still can't look at me, can you? And it went against me.
The meeting had unforeseen consequences for Liz. Neary convinced the parole board of his shame and remorse. It was the beginning of the process that would end up with him and his fellow killers being released.
If I had my time over again, I would never do it. You know, I opened the doors for everyone to do it, but now I would not do it. Backfires on you, because they're not interested. Do you know? Once they've made up their mind that they're coming out, they're coming out.
I think the pain that she felt doing it, and the anger and the anguish that she felt, I think it was worth it because she felt she was contributing. But mainly, as I said earlier, the thrust was for Michael, and that kept her going all the way through the bad times. Is I'm doing this for Michael, I'm doing this for Michael. He's not here, I'm doing it for Michael.
By 2013, all three killers had been released from prison.
There's some control over them for the rest of their lives. Until they Neary, Bentley and McKeithy die, they are subject to that life imprisonment sentence. And if their behaviour deteriorates, not necessarily committing acts of violence, but if they can be recalled immediately to prison.
I don't care what happens to them, they've got to meet their maker. And I will never see them because they're not allowed back on Merseyside. That's it. That's my point on it.
Liz has no interest in the killers anymore, and only happy memories for her Michael.
He's still that 15-year-old boy. Do you know? My children have had their children, and you wonder if Michael... Well, I know Michael would have had children. He was good looking. He was a good looking boy. And, I can't wait to be with him. I hope I spend a few more years with my grandchildren, but I'll be at peace when I'm with him. That's when I'll get peace. But I hope he's at peace with his dad.